The snow came in sideways that night, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack driving hard across the empty streets of Spokane, like the city itself was trying to push everyone indoors and keep them there. It was the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. It got into your jacket, past your collar, down into the place behind your sternum where warmth was supposed to live, and it stayed there quiet and relentless until you stopped noticing it was there at all, which was the most dangerous part. Cole Hargrove had ridden in worse. He'd ridden through the tail end of a November ice storm outside of Billings, once the kind where the road looked dry, but wasn't where your tires found nothing beneath them for half a second that felt like half a lifetime. He'd ridden through heat so thick in the Arizona desert that the air above the asphalt shimmered like standing water. He'd ridden through grief and fury and the particular numbness that came after too many funerals for men who were too young to be in the ground. He knew how to ride through things. That was the one skill the road had given him without asking for anything in return. But tonight was quiet. Tonight was just cold and dark, and the three of them moving together through streets that had given up on the evening hours ago. Spokane in February had a way of emptying itself out by 9 o'clock, folding its people indoors behind lit windows and locked doors, leaving the streets to whoever had nowhere better to be. Cole had always found something honest about that. The city at this hour showed you its bones. No performance, no pretense. Just concrete and lamplight and the sound of engines cutting through wind. Birch Calloway was riding to his left close enough that Cole could see the set of his jaw when they passed under a streetlight. Birch always rode like he was in conversation with the road, easy and loose, like a man who'd made his peace with motion years ago. He was the kind of man who could fill a room just by walking into it, not because of his size, which was considerable, but because of the quality of his attention. Birch noticed things. He noticed when someone's coffee had gone cold and refilled it without being asked. He noticed when a story someone was telling had a hole in it and never said so. He was in all the ways that mattered the kind of person who made the people around him feel less alone simply by being present. But even Birch had gone quiet tonight. No hand signals, no quick looks over, no small gestures that meant nothing and everything at the same time. The way they did between men who'd ridden together long enough to develop their own language. Just forward motion. Just the snow and the cold and the three of them holding a steady line down a street that had nothing left to offer the night. Dax Merritt rode to Cole's right. Dax always rode right. It wasn't something they'd ever discussed. It had simply settled into place the way most true things did between them, without ceremony, without announcement. Dax was the kind of man who occupied space differently than other people. Quieter, more deliberate. When Dax Merritt stood somewhere, he didn't just stand there. He held the ground. Cole had seen it 100 times. The way people unconsciously adjusted their path when Dax was nearby. The way a room reorganized itself slightly around him without anyone understanding why. It wasn't menace exactly. It was something older than menace. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided long ago that he would not be moved. Dax spoke less than anyone Cole had ever known, and every word he used had been weighed first, turned over, examined for necessity before it was released. In 16 years of knowing him, Cole had never once heard him say something he didn't mean. They were heading back from nothing important. A run that had turned into a late dinner at a place outside of town that kept the kitchen open past 10, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the pie was extraordinary, and the waitress knew their names and didn't ask questions. They did this sometimes, just rode, just moved, because some evenings the clubhouse felt too still, and the road felt like the only answer to a question none of them had words for. Cole had been riding for 20 years, and he still couldn't explain it to someone who didn't already understand. The road didn't fix things. It didn't solve anything. But it gave you motion when the alternative was sitting still with whatever was pressing down on you, and sometimes motion was enough. He almost missed her. That was the thing he would come back to later in the quiet hours, when the clubhouse was still, and the others were asleep, and he sat with whatever was left of the evening. He almost missed her. The shape was so small against the base of the dumpster, tucked into the angle where metal met concrete, that his brain had already filed it away before his eyes had finished processing it. Fabric. old fabric, a bundle of something left out by whoever had given up on it. Spokane had corners like this, places where the discarded things of the city collected. His brain said nothing. His brain said, keep writing. But his hands didn't listen. He was breaking before he understood why. Not hard, not dramatic, just the gradual slowing of a man whose body had registered something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. The bundle moved. That was it. That was the whole of it. Just the smallest shift, a contraction, like something trying to make itself smaller than it already was. And Cole Hargrove pulled over to the side of the road in the snow and cold of a February night in Spokane because a pile of old clothes had moved, and something in the oldest part of him said, that's not clothes. Birch and Dax pulled up behind him without question. That was another thing about men who'd ridden together long enough. You didn't need an explanation for a stop. If Cole stopped, there was a reason. The reason would reveal itself. They killed their engines, and the night went suddenly very quiet. Just the wind and the distant sound of the city doing whatever the city did when it thought no one was watching. Cole swung off his bike and crossed the sidewalk in 4 steps and crouched down in the snow. And what he found there rearranged something inside him so completely and so permanently that he would never quite be able to describe it to anyone who asked. A girl. Small, 10 years old maybe, though she looked younger in the way that children who haven't been eating look younger, the cheeks too hollow, the skin too close to the bone underneath. She was curled into herself with the instinctive geometry of someone who had been cold for a very long time and had organized her body around the project of staying warm, arms pulled and knees drawn up, face tucked down. Her jacket was thin, summer weight, the kind of thing you grabbed on your way out the door on an October morning when you thought the cold hadn't fully arrived yet. It had no business being on a child's body in February. Her lips had gone pale. Not the pale of cold exactly, but the pale of a body beginning to make decisions about which parts of itself it could afford to keep warm and which parts it couldn't. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tear tracks that had frozen slightly at the edges. She was trembling, but only barely, and Cole knew enough about cold to know that barely was not a comfort. Barely meant the shivering had been going on for a long time. Barely meant the body was getting tired of the effort. He pulled off his gloves and put his bare hand near her face, not touching just close enough to feel the temperature of the air around her. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. "Hey," he said. He kept his voice low and even, the way you spoke to something frightened, something that might bolt if you came at it with too much. "Hey, I'm right here." She didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was there. He could see it shallow and uneven, the rhythm of it slightly off in a way that made his chest tighten. Birch was already moving. Cole heard him behind him, the snap of a saddlebag opening, the rustle of the emergency blanket they kept rolled up behind the tools. Dax hadn't moved toward the girl. He'd moved to the street. He was standing at the edge of the curb with his back to all of them, watching the road in both directions, his shoulders square, his hands loose at his sides. Nobody had asked him to do that. He had simply understood that this moment needed a perimeter, and he had become one. The blanket came over Cole's shoulder, and he took it and shook it open and draped it around the girl's shoulders, tucking it in at the sides, with hands that were steadier than he felt. She stirred at the warmth. Her eyes came open, halfway unfocused at first, just the automatic response of a body registering a change in its conditions. "There you go," Cole said softly. "There you go." Birch appeared at his side with a sandwich still in its paper wrapper, squashed flat from the saddlebag. "But there." He held it out to Cole without a word. Cole unwrapped one end of it and held it close to the girl's face. "Can you try a bite?" he said. "Just one. Just a small one." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't focused, wasn't tracking where she was or who these men were or what the night had become around her. Cole waited. He didn't push it. He just held the sandwich where she could smell it, close enough to be an offer rather than a demand. And then her mouth opened, just slightly, just enough. She took the smallest bite imaginable, less than a bite really, just the ghost of one, and then she stopped, and Cole watched her face as the basic animal fact of food registered somewhere deeper than consciousness. She took another bite, larger this time. Then another. Birch let out a breath behind him. Cole heard it and understood it completely. There was something about watching a person eat when they'd stopped expecting to that got into you in ways you couldn't prepare for. He'd felt it before in other contexts, other hard years, but never quite like this. Never this precisely. The girl's eyes found his face. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked the way children looked when they hadn't yet learned to perform the act of looking, when their gaze was still honest and direct and unmediated by whatever social editing adulthood eventually installed. She looked at him like she was reading something written in a language she hadn't known she could read. "What's your name?" Cole asked. She didn't answer right away. Several seconds passed. Birch crouched down on the other side of her, giving her 2 points of warm human presence, instead of one not crowding, just present. The wind moved through the gap between buildings, and the blanket shifted slightly, and Cole reached out and held it in place at her shoulder. "Lydia," she said finally. Her voice was barely there, worn down to almost nothing, like a battery that had been running too long on too little. Birch's breath caught. Cole heard it happen. He kept his own face still. "Lydia," Birch said, and even in the way he repeated it, Cole could hear something in his friend's voice that Birch would never say directly. Something that had to do with a name being more than a name. Something that had to do with the fact that she had one, that there was a Lydia here, that this was a specific person with a specific name who had been out here in the February cold long enough that her lips had gone pale and her shivering had slowed to almost nothing. "How long have you been out here?" Cole asked. Lydia didn't answer. She looked down at the ground between her knees at the snow that had packed itself into the angle between the dumpster and the pavement. Cole waited. He was good at waiting. He'd learned it the hard way in houses where patience was the only currency a child had, in rooms where the wrong question at the wrong moment cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. He waited. It was when he reached out to tuck the blanket more securely around her wrist that he saw it. A hospital bracelet or something like one. Institutional. White plastic with black print, worn and partially torn, hanging loose on her thin wrist, like it had been there long enough to become part of the landscape of her. He tilted her wrist gently toward the nearest streetlight and read what was printed on it. Spokane Children's Home. He felt the ground shift under him. Not physically, something older than the physical. He'd heard that phrase before. He'd heard it in a different way from the inside, the way you heard the names of places that had held you when you were too young to understand what holding even meant. He hadn't grown up in Spokane. He'd grown up in 3 different states and 7 different houses, and he'd been inside institutions that had different names but the same grammar. The same smell of industrial cleaning products and communal sadness. The same loneliness that only existed in rooms full of people where none of them were yours. He knew what that bracelet meant. It meant she hadn't wandered away from a home. It meant she'd run from one. He looked up at Birch. Birch had seen it too. His face had gone very still, which was the most alarming thing Birch's face could do. Cole didn't look for Dax. He already knew what Dax was doing. Standing at the street, watching, holding the perimeter so that nothing else could come at them from the dark. He looked back at Lydia. "We're going to take you somewhere warm," he said. Not a question, not a negotiation, just a fact delivered in the quiet register you used when you needed something to be true. "Is that okay?" She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes, not quite trust, not yet, but the consideration of it, the beginning of the calculation. Then she nodded just barely, just the smallest commitment her body was willing to make. Cole lifted her. She was light in the way that alarmed him, the way that meant the weight was wrong, that something had been used up over days that should not have been used up. She didn't resist. She let herself be gathered up with the resigned trust of someone who had run out of better options, and something about that hit Cole somewhere deep and unguarded and stayed there. He carried her to his bike and held her against his chest, and Birch kept the blanket wrapped around her, and Dax appeared at Cole's side without being summoned and opened the saddlebag and found the spare jacket he kept there, heavy canvas lined with fleece, and draped it over the blanket without ceremony. They worked together the way they always worked, without instructions, without discussion, each of them understanding instinctively what the moment needed and providing it without fanfare. The ride to the clubhouse was slow and careful. Cole held Lydia in front of him on the bike, her small back against his chest, his arms on either side of her, working the handlebars, the blanket and jacket cocooning her against the wind. He felt her breathing change as they rode, felt it slow into something more regular, more deep. The warmth of the engine and the warmth of his body and the warmth of the fabric around her was doing something the cold had been trying to undo for however many days she'd been out there. He didn't push the speed. He took every turn easy and wide and deliberate. The clubhouse was lit when they pulled up. It usually was. There were always two or three members around in the evening, men who kept later hours or had nowhere else they preferred to be. And when Cole came through the door carrying a 10-year-old girl wrapped in a canvas work jacket, the room reorganized itself quietly around that fact. Nobody panicked. Nobody asked foolish questions. A man named Garrett, who was 53 and had been with the club for 19 years and had the hands of someone who had worked hard. His whole life took one look and went immediately to the back room to start the heating elements on the old space heater. A woman named Phyllis, whose husband was a member and who spent most Tuesday evenings at the clubhouse because she preferred the company here to the quiet of her own house, was in the kitchen before anyone asked her to be. Cole could hear the sound of a pot being put on a burner, the sound of someone beginning to do the most practical and loving thing available to them. He settled Lydia on the couch, the best couch, the long one against the wall that had been reupholstered twice in the last decade, and was the closest thing the clubhouse had to genuine comfort. He sat beside her, without crowding her leaving space, letting her understand that proximity didn't have to mean pressure. She looked around the room slowly. Her eyes tracked the faces, the furniture, the things hanging on the walls, the low light and the worn wood, and the smell of the place, which was coffee and motor oil and old leather and years of people living close together. It was not a fancy place. It had never tried to be. But it was warm, and the warmth was not a small thing. Cole watched her feel it, watched it move across her face the way relief moved when it finally arrived after a long absence. Birch sat across from her on the arm of the other chair, keeping careful distance, his hands loose between his knees. He was making himself smaller than he was, which was something Cole had watched Birch do before in situations that required it. Birch understood intuitively that sometimes the kindest thing a large man could do was to take up less space. Dax stood in the doorway to the hall, not entering, not leaving, just present. If you didn't know him, you might have read it as indifference. If you knew him, you understood it for what it was. He was making himself available without making himself an intrusion. He was giving the girl his presence without asking anything of her in return. Phyllis came out with soup. Real soup, something from a pot, something that had onion and salt and heat in it. She set it on the low table in front of Lydia with a spoon and a folded paper towel, and then she stepped back without saying anything. And that restraint, that understanding that what the moment needed was not words, but food and warmth in the absence of demands made Cole's chest ache in a way he couldn't account for. Lydia ate, slowly at first with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to trust that food would stay available. Then more steadily. The soup went down and the color came back into her face in increments so gradual you might miss it if you weren't watching. Cole was watching. After a while, the room settled into a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. The heater hummed. The kitchen made small sounds. Outside, the snow continued its work against the windows, but it couldn't get in. "You don't have to talk," Cole said eventually. "You don't have to do anything right now, just sit." She looked at him, really looked again with that direct, honest gaze that hadn't yet learned to look away. "I ran away," she said. Cole held still. "From the children's home," she said. He nodded once. The room had gone very quiet. He could feel Birch not moving. He could feel Dax in the doorway, the quality of his stillness shifting in a way that only Cole would have noticed. "How long ago?" Cole asked. She looked at her hands wrapped around the soup bowl for warmth. "I don't know. 5 days maybe? Maybe more." 5 days. 5 days in Spokane in February. He did the math without wanting to, and the math was brutal. Why? He asked. He kept his voice soft, neutral, not demanding, just leaving the space open for whatever she chose to put in it. She was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence but preparation. The quiet of someone deciding whether to trust a thing, whether the cost of saying the true thing out loud was lower than the cost of keeping it inside. Cole waited. He was the best at waiting of the three of them. He'd had the most practice and paid the highest tuition for it. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that he had to lean forward slightly to catch the words. "Because no one noticed when I was there," she said, "and I wanted to know if no one would notice when I was gone." Cole heard Birch make a sound behind him. Not a word, just a sound. The involuntary sound of a body responding to something that had hit it in a place it wasn't prepared for. Cole didn't make a sound. He didn't trust himself to. He sat with what she'd said, and he let it be what it was, which was the truest and most devastating sentence a 10-year-old should never have had reason to construct. He sat with it, and he thought about a boy in a house in Wisconsin who was 11 years old and lying on his back in the dark, staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize, and making a decision so quiet and so permanent that it had taken him 20 years to fully understand what he'd decided. The decision to stop expecting anyone to come. He understood exactly what Lydia had done. She hadn't run because she was reckless. She hadn't run because she was careless or impulsive or any of the things an institution might write on a report to explain a missing child. She'd run as an experiment. She'd run to find out if the answer would be different this time. And the answer for 5 days in February had been no. No one had come. No one had looked. Until tonight. Cole Hargrove looked at this girl with her hollow cheeks and her frozen tear tracks and her thin summer jacket and her pale lips that were finally finding their color again in the warmth of the clubhouse couch, and he felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pity. Pity was something you felt from a distance, something that kept you separate from the thing that caused it. This was not that. This was recognition. The gut-level recognition of someone who had been the same child in a different body in a different decade and who had spent his whole adult life building something solid enough to stand on so he'd never have to feel that particular ceiling above him again. "You're not invisible," he said. He didn't plan to say it. It came from somewhere below planning. She looked at him. "You're not," he said. "Whatever they made you feel like in there, whatever that place gave you or didn't give you, you're not invisible. You're sitting right here, and I can see you just fine." She didn't say anything, but something in her face changed. Something around her eyes, the smallest shift, like a door that had been locked a long time, moving a fraction of an inch without opening all the way. It was enough. It was more than enough. She fell asleep within the hour. It came on her the way sleep came on people who had been running from it for days all at once and without ceremony, her head tipping sideways and her body going soft against the cushions. Cole reached over and adjusted the canvas jacket that Dax had draped over her, making sure it covered her shoulders, and then he sat back and watched her breathe. The room was quiet. The heater hummed. Birch had moved to the chair across the room and was sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, with the expression of a man sorting through something he hadn't been handed the tools for. Dax had come fully into the room at some point and was standing with his back against the far wall, arms crossed, eyes on the girl. His face was doing the thing it did when he felt something too large for his usual containment sealed tight, holding whatever it was under considerable pressure. None of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Birch looked up. His eyes moved to Cole, and the question in them was the same question that had been sitting in the middle of the room since the moment Cole had picked her up off the pavement. Cole knew what had to happen. He knew it before Birch's eyes asked it, knew it the same way he knew the temperature of a road or the weight of the incoming weather. They couldn't keep her without telling someone. That wasn't a legal judgment. It was a practical reality, and it was also simply true. She was a ward of the state. She had a wristband. Somewhere in a building across town, a record existed with her name on it. And they had a legal obligation to that record, even if the institution behind it had failed her so completely that she'd run into a Spokane winter rather than spend another night inside its walls. He hated it. He hated every single part of it. But he picked up his phone. He made the call. He kept his voice steady through the whole of it, giving the necessary information to the necessary people. And when he put the phone back in his pocket, he sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and looked at Lydia sleeping on the couch. She had one small hand tucked under her cheek. Her breathing had deepened into something slow and regular that meant she was genuinely fully under, getting the sleep that 5 days on the street had taken from her. He had maybe 2 hours before whoever was coming would arrive. He used them to sit beside her. That was all. He didn't pace, didn't plan, didn't run the angles on what came next. He just sat beside her and listened to her breathe and let himself understand what was happening, which was that this girl had run from a place that couldn't see her and ended up in the hands of 3 men who were already beginning to understand that they were never going to be able to look away. Claire Hendricks arrived just before midnight. She came in a county car, dark blue standard issue, and she was dressed for a night call, practically dark coat and flat shoes and a canvas bag over one shoulder and a tablet in her hand. She was in her mid-30s, and she had the look of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know that what she was about to walk into could be any number of things, and that the only way to handle that was to suspend assumption and deal with what was actually in front of her. Cole respected that before she'd said a word. She took in the 3 of them, the leather and the size, and the general appearance of men who did not look like the conventional setting for a rescued child, and her face registered it and then moved past it without drama. Claire Hendricks, she said. CPS. Cole Hargrove, Cole said. Her eyes moved to the couch, to Lydia still sleeping. She crossed the room and crouched down beside the couch and looked at Lydia for a long time. Not touching, just looking, and Cole watched her face and saw that whatever professional distance she'd constructed over 11 years of this work had not completely insulated her from the sight of a 10-year-old asleep in a motorcycle clubhouse, wrapped in a canvas work jacket because the alternative had been a dumpster in February. She stood and turned to face Cole. "How long has she been here?" she asked. "About 2 hours," he said. "We found her around 10. Got her warm, got some food in her, then called." "She was conscious when you found her?" "Barely. She came around quickly once we got her inside." Claire wrote something on her tablet. "You said she indicated she'd been outside for approximately 5 days. That's what she told us." Claire's jaw tightened, brief, barely visible, but Cole caught it. "And the children's home didn't report her missing." It wasn't a question. Cole answered it anyway. "I don't know what they reported. I know no one came looking." The room was quiet. Birch hadn't moved from his chair. Dax was still against the far wall, still and watchful. Claire looked at the wristband on Lydia's wrist, still visible below the edge of the jacket. She looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to for purely informational purposes. "She has to come with me," Claire said. Cole felt the words land in the room. "Where?" he asked. "Back to the children's home. For tonight. There's a process." "She ran from that place," Birch said from across the room. His voice was even, but the evenness was working hard, holding something back. "I understand that," Claire said. "She ran from it and spent 5 days on the street in February rather than go back to it," Birch said. "And your process is to send her back there." "Mr. Calloway." "Mr. Calloway, I hear you. I do. But she is a ward of the state, and I don't have a legal alternative tonight. There are procedures. There are protections in place. And right now, those procedures left a 10-year-old outside for 5 days, Dax said. It was the first time he'd spoken since they'd found her. His voice was low and very quiet, and the quietness of it was somehow louder than any volume would have been. Claire looked at him. Dax looked back. He didn't elaborate. He never did. But he didn't need to. Claire held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, which was not something most people managed when they were trying to hold the professional line against Dax's merit. "I know," she said. And the flatness of it, the weight of it told Cole that this was not a woman reciting procedure from behind a wall. This was a woman who knew exactly what the system had done and was standing inside it anyway because she didn't know what else to stand inside. He understood that. He'd felt that specific helplessness before in different shapes. He was about to respond when Lydia stirred. The shift in her was immediate. The moment her eyes opened and found Claire standing in the room, the sleep fell off her and something else took its place. Something old and practiced and deeply unhappy. She pulled the jacket tighter. She pressed herself back into the couch cushions like she was trying to go through them. "No," she said, barely a sound. Claire stepped forward, crouching down, her voice going gentle. "Lydia, my name is Claire. I'm here to help you." "No!" Louder this time. "I don't want to go back." "I know, but right now, no." Lydia's voice broke on the word. Her eyes came up past Claire and found Cole, and what Cole saw in them hit him somewhere below the ribs and stayed there. It was the look of someone who had extended trust at enormous personal cost and was watching it be revoked by forces larger than any of the individuals involved. It was the look he had given people as a child when the fourth home and the fifth home and the sixth home ended the same way as all the others. The look that asked, "Why did I let myself believe this time would be different?" She reached for him. Her small hands found the front of his jacket and held on, not frantically, not with a wild grip of panic, but with the particular grip of a child who has already understood that asking doesn't work and has moved on to simply refusing to let go. "Please," she said, "please don't let them take me." Cole looked at her hands on his jacket. He looked at her face. He looked at Claire standing to his left, doing the thing that was required of her by 11 years of a job that hadn't insulated her from this moment, even if it had made her responsible for executing it. He looked back at Lydia, and he did the hardest thing he'd done in a long time. He covered her hands with one of his gently and held them for a moment and said, "Look at me." She did. "I'm not disappearing," he said. "You hear me? This isn't me walking away. This isn't over. I don't know how yet, and I'm not going to make you a promise about the shape of it tonight. But I am telling you that I see you. I've seen you since the minute I found you on that street, and I'm not going to stop." Her breath was coming in uneven increments. Tears had started, not the theatrical tears of a child trying to achieve an outcome, but the quiet ones that came when a body ran out of the energy to keep feeling something privately. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. "You don't have to yet," Cole said. "You just have to get through tonight." A long moment passed, long enough for Cole to feel every second of it against his skin. And then slowly Lydia's hands released his jacket. She stood. She was shaking, and it wasn't from cold this time. Dax appeared at the edge of Cole's vision, and he was holding Lydia's thin summer jacket, the one she'd been wearing when they found her, which someone had quietly dried and warmed near the heater. He crossed to her and held it out, and she looked at him for a moment, and then turned and let him help her put it on. He did it without speaking, just efficiently and gently, and then he stepped back. Claire moved to Lydia's side. "Ready?" Lydia didn't answer. She just looked at Cole one more time. He held her gaze and he nodded once, and he tried to put into that single movement everything he didn't have language for. "I see you. I'm not finished. This is not the end of this." She turned and walked with Claire toward the door. Cole stood and watched them go. He heard the door open and a gust of February air moved through the room, and then the door closed again, and the room went quiet in the way rooms went quiet after something essential had left them. Birch was on his feet. He'd stood without Cole noticing, and now he was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that Cole had only seen a few times in 20 years. The look that meant something had gotten through the considerable defenses that Birch Calloway had spent his whole life constructing against the world. Dax hadn't moved from where he'd stepped back after helping Lydia with her jacket. He was standing still in the way he stood still when he was holding something very heavy, very carefully, the way you held something that would damage the floor if you dropped it. Cole went to the window. He watched Claire's car pull away from the curb. He watched the red taillights move down the street through the falling snow and turn the corner and disappear. The clubhouse was warm. The heater was still humming. Lydia's soup bowl was still on the low table, half empty, the spoon beside it, and the folded paper towel Phyllis had set out next to that. Nobody moved it. Nobody said anything for a long time. Birch finally spoke. "We're not done here," he said. It was not a question. Cole kept his eyes on the window, on the place where the taillights had been. "No," he said, "we're not." The blanket was still on the couch the next morning. Cole came out of the back room at 6 earlier than usual, having slept the way he slept, when something was working on him in short intervals, with long stretches of ceiling staring in between. The clubhouse was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that belonged only to early morning, before the day had fully committed to being anything in particular. Gray light came through the windows in thin strips. The heater had cycled down overnight and the room had gone cool without going cold. He saw the blanket immediately. It was exactly where it had been when Claire's car pulled away, folded more or less against the armrest of the long couch, still holding the compressed shape of a small body that had slept in it. Nobody had touched it. He didn't know if that was intentional or if people had simply moved around it the way you moved around something you weren't ready to make a decision about. Either way, it was there. And looking at it did something to the inside of his chest that he wasn't prepared for at 6 in the morning on 4 hours of bad sleep. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen counter and listened to the machine work and looked at the wall and did not think about anything specific, which was a skill he developed over years of mornings that required him to be functional before he was ready. You didn't think about everything at once. You thought about the coffee first. Then you thought about what came next. Birch came in 20 minutes later. He looked like he'd slept about as well as Cole had, which was to say not particularly. He poured himself a cup without speaking and stood on the other side of the counter, and they drank in silence for a while, in the way men who had known each other long enough sometimes communicated best. Dax arrived 20 minutes after that. He appeared from the back hallway, and Cole could tell by the economy of his movements the specific way his body carried itself when it had been awake too long that he hadn't slept at all, or had given up on the attempt early enough to make the distinction irrelevant. He poured coffee, turned, leaned against the counter, and looked at the couch from across the room. At the blanket. None of them said anything for another few minutes. The coffee was strong, the way clubhouse coffee was always strong at that hour, and Cole drank it anyway because the familiar taste of it was what the morning required before anything else could happen. It was Birch who finally said what all three of them had been sitting inside since the taillights of Claire's car had disappeared around the corner. "We can't just leave it here," he said. He wasn't talking about the blanket. Cole set his cup down. "I know." "5 days," Birch said. "She was out there 5 days and they didn't send anyone." "I know. And we just handed her back to them." Cole looked at him. "We called it in because not calling it in would have made things worse for her long term. You know that. Knowing it doesn't make it sit better." "No," Cole agreed. "It doesn't." Dax walked out of the kitchen and into the main room without a word. He stood in front of the couch for a moment. Then he sat down on the far end of it, away from the blanket, and put his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. Cole watched him from the kitchen doorway. He'd known Dax Merritt for 16 years, and he'd learned over those years to read the differences between his silences. This one said, "I went somewhere last night and I haven't fully come back yet." Cole understood. He hadn't fully come back either. He picked up his phone and looked at Claire Hendrick's number. She'd given it to him when she arrived, standard procedure, a contact for follow-up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and decided that before he called anyone, he needed to understand what he was actually asking for. Asking was one thing. Asking with intention, asking with a plan, asking in a way that moved something forward rather than just expressing how he felt about a situation he hadn't caused, but had somehow become responsible for. That was something different. He went and sat with the others, and they worked through it not formally, not with anything resembling a structured conversation, but the way the three of them had always worked through things in fragments, in long silences between building towards something without announcing they were building toward it. Dax was the one who went to the children's home first. Cole found out about it after the fact, which was typical of Dax, who had never in 16 years asked permission to do a thing he'd already decided to do. He went on the morning of the second day. He didn't call ahead. He simply rode over and walked inside and asked to see Lydia. They told him she wasn't available for visits. He asked why. They told him visits required prior authorization from a guardian or caseworker. He asked who her caseworker was. They told him that information was confidential. He asked if they could at least confirm that she was there and that she was okay. They told him they couldn't confirm information about residents to members of the public. He came back to the clubhouse and told Cole what they'd said, relaying it flatly and without embellishment, just the facts of it. And Cole listened and felt the specific anger that came not from cruelty, but from the bureaucratic version of it, which was in some ways harder to hold on to because there was nobody in particular to direct it at. Dax went back on the fourth day. This time, the person at the front desk was different, younger. And Dax, who did not naturally present himself as a man you told no to without some consideration of the consequences, had perhaps not modulated himself as carefully on the second visit as the first. The person called their supervisor. The supervisor told Dax that if he returned without a court-authorized relationship to the child, they would contact law enforcement. He came back and Cole saw it in his face when he walked through the door, the expression of a man who has been stopped not by force but by paperwork, and who finds that more infuriating than force because he knows how to handle force. Paperwork was different. Paperwork had no pressure points. Birch, meanwhile, had been on the phone. This was Birch's mode when he was working a problem, not physical action but information gathering, calling people, working angles, finding out what the actual shape of a thing was before trying to move it. He knew a man who'd done some family law work, not a close friend, an acquaintance from years back who owed him a favor from a situation that didn't require elaboration. He called in the favor and got 40 minutes on the phone and came back to the table with notes. He spread the notes out and the three of them stood around the table and looked at them. Foster care application. Background checks for all proposed caregivers. Home visits, minimum 3. Formal interviews with a CPS assessor. Character references. Financial documentation. Criminal history review. A waiting period for the home to be assessed. Court involvement. A judge's approval. How long, Cole asked. Birch looked at his notes. Best case a few months, more likely longer, and that's if nothing goes wrong. Cole looked at the list. It was long and specific, and every item on it was something that could go wrong in a way that applied specifically to 3 men who rode motorcycles and had the kind of past that didn't look uncomplicated on paper, even when the people involved had spent years putting real distance between themselves and what the paper recorded. They're going to look at everything, Birch said. Not just us individually, the club. Let them, Cole said. Birch looked at him. Cole, I said let them. We're not hiding anything. That's not what I mean. I mean they're going to use the club as a concept, not us specifically, the idea of what we are. Cole understood what he meant. He'd understood it before Birch said it. A motorcycle club occupied a specific space in the American imagination, and it was not the space that child welfare courts viewed favorably. It didn't matter what was actually true about these specific men in this specific building. It mattered what was presumed true and what would be presumed true by a system that dealt in categories and precedents and the careful management of institutional risk. He picked up his phone and called Claire Hendricks. She answered on the third ring, which told him she'd been expecting the call. Mr. Hargrove, she said. Cole, he said. Is there a legal way to get her out of there? A pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer. The pause of someone deciding how to give it. There is, she said. Foster care application with adoption as the stated long-term intent. It's a formal process. It takes time. How much time? Depends on how the evaluation goes. Minimum several months, potentially longer. And if the evaluation doesn't go well, another pause. Then the application is denied and you have no legal standing to pursue it further. Cole held the phone and looked at the far wall of the clubhouse, at the window through which he could see a thin strip of Spokane Street, gray and empty in the winter light. "What are our chances?" he asked. Claire was quiet for long enough that he knew the nature of the answer before she gave it. "Honest answer, I don't know. There are factors in your favor. Your background, the circumstances of how you found her, what I observed when I came to the clubhouse. But there are factors working against you, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I minimize them. Tell me, the club is going to be an issue, not you personally, the association, and your history, all three of you, it's not going to look uncomplicated on paper." "No," Cole said, "it's not. There's also the matter of Gerald Voss." He didn't know the name. "Who is he?" "He's the state's attorney assigned to Lydia's case. He handles placement disputes, contested foster arrangements. He's experienced and he's thorough, and he has a particular perspective on what constitutes a suitable home environment. And we don't fit his perspective. You don't fit the conventional version of it," Claire said carefully, "which is what he works from." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Can we win?" Claire took a breath. "I think you can try," she said. "And I think trying is worth something because right now the alternative for Lydia is staying where she is until she ages out or runs again. And I don't think either of those ends particularly well." She paused. "I'll send you the paperwork. But Cole, I need you to understand something before you start this." "Go ahead." "If this falls apart partway through, it's going to hurt her more than not starting it at all. She already—" Claire stopped. Started again. "I saw her this morning. She asked me if you were coming back." The words went into Cole and stayed there. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her I didn't know," Claire said. "Because I didn't. But I told her she should eat her breakfast." After he hung up, Cole sat for a long time with the phone in his hand. Birch and Dax were both in the room, existing quietly in the same space, without demanding anything from it, the way they did when something was being processed, and processing required room. "She asked if I was coming back," Cole said. "Nobody said anything." "She asked this morning, first thing." The room held the information. Let it settle. The paperwork arrived 2 days later. Claire sent it digitally and Cole printed it out on the clubhouse printer that was older than most people's marriages and still somehow functional, and the pages came out slightly misaligned and warm, and he spread them on the big table in the main room, and the three of them stood around it and looked at the stack. It was substantial. Every form was its own small negotiation with a system designed. Cole understood not with malice but with caution, with the determination to make the process difficult enough that only people who truly meant it would see it through. There was a logic to that. He could see the logic even while resenting what it meant for them specifically. "Background checks," Birch said, reading. "All three of us." "Financial documentation," Dax said. He rarely read aloud. The fact that he was doing it now meant he was making an inventory, deciding what they were walking into with clear eyes. "Home visits," Cole said. "Minimum 3. They're going to come here." They all looked around the clubhouse, at the worn furniture and the tool calendars on the wall, and the bike parts in the corner that someone had been meaning to move for 6 months and hadn't. At the bar along the back wall that was used mostly for coffee, but looked like what it was. "We clean it up," Birch said. "We're not hiding what this place is," Cole said. "I didn't say hide it. I said clean it up. There's a difference between those two things." Dax nodded once. They filed the paperwork over the next week. Cole handled most of it personally, sitting at the table in the evenings with the forms spread out in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, working through each section with the methodical patience he applied to engines and to roads and to anything that required sustained attention in the face of complexity. He answered every question honestly. He didn't soften things that didn't need to be softened. He didn't reach for language that made his past look like something it wasn't. His record was his record. His history was his history. He had been in 7 houses in 10 years. He had grown up without a stable address or a consistent adult. He had made choices in his 20s that he would make differently now. None of that was untrue, and none of it was the whole truth either. and the forms didn't have space for the whole truth. So he gave them what fit in the boxes and trusted that the rest would have to come through in other ways in rooms in person, in the unrepeatable specificity of face-to-face human accounting. The background check came back first. Cole's was complicated. Birch's was more complicated. Dax's was the least complicated of the three, which surprised people who made assumptions about Dax based on his appearance and surprised nobody who actually knew him. Stanton Webb found out what was happening on the fifth day. Cole hadn't told the wider club because he hadn't been sure what there was to tell, yet hadn't wanted to raise something that might not become anything. But Stanton Webb had been with the club for 22 years, and he had the awareness of a man who had watched many things unfold in many rooms and had developed a reliable instinct for when something significant was moving through a space, even when it was moving quietly. He came to Cole on a Thursday evening and sat down across from him at the table where the paperwork was spread out and looked at it for a moment without touching it. "The girl," he said. Cole looked at him. "Yeah." Stanton nodded slowly. He was 62, and he had the face of someone who had lived outdoors for most of his life, deeply lined, weathered in a way that had stopped being aging and had become something more like topography. He'd been sober for 14 years, and he spoke with the measured quality of a man who had learned through hard experience to mean every word he said. "What do you need?" Stanton said. Cole looked at him. "I don't know yet." "When you know," Stanton said, "tell me." He got up and left. That was all. Cole sat and looked at the paperwork and felt the weight of the club behind him in a way that was different from the usual weight, less about solidarity in a conflict and more about something quieter and more essential. Something that had to do with people who had built their own definition of family, choosing to extend that definition without being asked. The first home visit happened on a Tuesday. Claire brought a colleague, a woman named Patricia, who said very little and wrote a great deal on her notepad, and they walked through the clubhouse with the careful attention of people looking for specific things in a specific order. Cole walked with them. Birch had organized the front room and cleared the bar area and moved the bike parts, and the place looked, if not domestic, then at least functional and deliberate. A place where people lived and worked and had made intentional choices about their environment. Claire's face gave away nothing. Patricia's face gave away less. They sat down afterward in the main room and went through a list of questions. They asked about sleeping arrangements, about the plan for school enrollment, about income sources, about health care, about how the environment would change to accommodate a child. Cole answered everything. Birch answered the questions directed at him. Dax answered his with the minimum number of words that constituted a complete and honest answer, which was his approach to most questions, and which Cole hoped read as quiet competence rather than evasion. When they left, Cole sat at the table and tried to read what had just happened, and found he couldn't. It was Birch who said what neither of them wanted to articulate. "We don't know how that went." "No," Cole said. "Could have been worse," Birch offered. "Could have been better," Dax said. They sat with that for a while. Inside the Spokane Children's Home, in a room she shared with two other girls, Lydia sat at the narrow window every afternoon and looked out at the street below. The view was not much. A parking lot, a sidewalk, a section of road that led somewhere she couldn't see from where she sat. But she looked at it anyway every day at the same time because looking at it was the closest thing she had to doing something. She kept a piece of paper in her pocket. She'd written the address on it the morning after she arrived back carefully from memory, reconstructing it from the street sign she'd seen when Claire's car had driven her away from the clubhouse. She didn't know if she had it exactly right. She kept it anyway, folded small and flat in the front pocket of her jeans, and she touched it sometimes without taking it out just to confirm it was still there. A girl named Sarah, who slept in the bed across from hers, had noticed. "Who are you waiting for?" Sarah asked one afternoon, watching Lydia at the window. Lydia thought about how to answer that. "Someone who made a promise," she said. "People break promises," Sarah said. Not cruelly, just as information, as something she had learned and was passing along. "I know," Lydia said. She looked back at the street. "But I'm waiting anyway." Gerald Voss made himself known on the 9th day. He didn't come to the clubhouse. He sent a letter formal and precise introducing himself as the state's attorney assigned to evaluate the suitability of the proposed foster placement. The letter was professionally correct in every particular, and it communicated between every line that he had already formed a view of the situation and that his view was not favorable. Cole read it twice, then a third time, more slowly, paying attention not to what it said, but to the structure of its objections, the architecture of the argument it was making. Voss wasn't arguing that Cole was a bad person. He wasn't arguing that Dax had a criminal history or that Birch was dangerous. He was arguing something more fundamental and more difficult to counter, that the environment represented by a motorcycle club was categorically not an appropriate setting for a child in state care. Not because of who these specific men were, because of what this specific context was. It was the argument that had no face. Cole had dealt with opponents before in the ways that men like him dealt with opponents, and there was always a face, always a person, always someone you could look at directly and engage with directly. Voss was making an argument designed to exist on paper in formal settings through institutional channels, and Cole understood immediately that countering it would require him to operate in territory where his instincts and strengths were not fully applicable. He called Claire. "I got Voss's letter," he said. "I expected you would," she said. "He's not arguing against us specifically. No, he's arguing against the category. How do you counter a category?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "You make it personal," she said. "You make it about Lydia specifically and you specifically and what actually exists between you rather than about what motorcycle clubs represent in theory. You force him to argue against a real child and real people rather than against an abstraction." You show up to the hearings," she said. "You tell the truth, and you let me do my job." Cole put the phone down and looked at the letter again, at the precise, reasonable, completely devastating language of it. Voss was good. He understood that immediately and without reservation. Voss was the kind of good that came from believing in what you were doing, and that was the hardest kind of fight because it didn't have the weakness that cynicism had. It was on the 11th night with the hearing 4 days away that Claire called at 10:30. Cole was still up sitting with the paperwork going through it again for the fourth time, looking for things he might have missed or phrased better. He answered on the first ring. "There's a problem," Claire said, and the way she said it told him the problem was real before she'd named it. "Tell me." Voss found something. A report from 3 years ago, an altercation outside the clubhouse. There were other parties involved. The report names Birch. Cole held very still. "It's not a criminal conviction," Claire said, "but it's documentation of an incident that Voss is going to characterize as evidence of a pattern of environment-related risk. He's going to argue that the club's physical setting has a documented history of conflict." "That incident was," Cole started. "I know, I've read the report. But it's on record, and Voss is going to put it in front of a judge, and how it looks in that context is going to be very different from how it was in reality." Cole was quiet. "I have to be honest with you," Claire said. "I don't know if we can overcome this before Thursday. I'm going to try, but I need you to be prepared for the possibility that the initial hearing doesn't go our way." Cole said nothing. "Cole, I heard you," he said. He sat with the phone in his hand after he hung up and looked at the wall for a long time. Then he got up and went to find Birch. He found him in the back room, sitting on the edge of the bunk with something in his hands that he put down when Cole came in. He looked at Cole's face and understood that what was coming required his full attention. Cole told him. He said it straight the way he said things that needed to be said straight, without softening the edges, because Birch deserved the full shape of what they were dealing with. Birch listened. His face went through several things and settled on something close to expressionless, which was never a good sign with Birch. He was quiet for a long time after Cole finished. "If I pull my name off the application," he said finally, "it removes the incident from the equation." Cole looked at him. "Without my name on it, Voss doesn't have that documentation to work with. You and Dax move forward with a cleaner record." "No," Cole said. "It's a practical solution." "No," Cole said again. It's not happening. Cole, if this fails because of me, it's not going to fail because of you, Cole said. And if it does, that's not on you. That's on a system that would use a 3-year-old incident report to keep a 10-year-old girl in a place she ran away from. We don't make it easier for them by dividing ourselves. Birch looked at him for a long time. You're sure? I was sure before you asked. Birch looked at the wall. Dax appeared in the doorway without sound, which was simply how Dax arrived places. He stood there and looked at Birch, and Birch looked back at him, and something moved between them in the wordless register that the three of them had been communicating in for years. Dax looked at Birch for a long moment. Then he said quietly and with finality, all three or none. He didn't elaborate. He never did. But the three words carried everything that needed carrying, and Birch heard all of it. Birch let out a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that carries something with it when it goes. All right, he said. Cole nodded. Nobody said anything else for a while. The clubhouse was quiet around them, the familiar quiet of the place they'd built and lived in, and made into the thing the world outside couldn't see when it looked at the word club and thought it knew what it meant. He thought about Lydia at the children's home. He thought about her at the window in the afternoons, which was something Claire had mentioned in passing during one of their calls. He thought about her keeping the piece of paper in her pocket. He thought about her telling that other girl someone who made a promise. He thought about the moment he'd covered her hands with his and told her this wasn't over. He thought about what it had cost her to let go of his jacket. He thought about a boy lying on his back in the dark in a house in Wisconsin, at 11 years old, looking at a ceiling he didn't recognize, deciding to stop expecting anyone to come. Cole Hargrove had spent 34 years building something on top of that decision. He had built a club, a family, a way of existing in the world that had its own code and its own loyalty and its own particular brand of dignity. He had built it piece by piece with men who understood what it was to need something solid when everything else was shifting, and he had built it without asking anyone's permission or seeking anyone's approval, because that was the only way he'd ever known how to build anything. On Thursday morning, he would walk into a courthouse and ask a system that had never much approved of men like him to look at what he'd built and call it enough. He had no idea if it would work, but he was going. All three of them were going. And somewhere across town, a 10-year-old girl was touching a folded piece of paper in her pocket and believing or trying to believe in a promise that had been made to her in a warm room on the worst night of her life. He was not going to make her wrong for believing it. Thursday came in gray and cold. The sky, the particular flat white of a Spokane winter that hadn't decided whether it was finished yet, holding its weather in reserve like a judgment it wasn't ready to deliver. Cole was awake before 5. He lay in the dark for a while and listened to the building breathe around him, the small sounds of a structure that had housed a great deal of living over many years. And then he got up because lying there wasn't doing anything useful. He stood in front of the narrow mirror in the back bathroom for longer than he usually stood in front of mirrors. He was wearing dark pants and a button-down shirt, charcoal gray, the kind of shirt that lived at the back of a drawer, and came out for occasions that required the acknowledgement that occasions existed. He looked at himself and thought about the version of this moment he'd imagined over the past 2 weeks. The version where he knew exactly what to say and how to say it, and walked in with the clean confidence of a man who understood the terrain. That version had not materialized. What had materialized was this himself in a gray shirt, in a narrow bathroom mirror at 5 in the morning, with a hearing in 4 hours that would determine whether a 10-year-old girl got to stop waiting at a window. He left the jacket on the chair. It was the first thing Birch noticed when Cole came out into the main room. Birch was already there, already dressed, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, and his eyes went immediately to Cole's shoulders, to the absence of the leather. And he understood it without having it explained, because Birch understood most things without having them explained. He didn't say anything about it. He just nodded. Dax appeared from the back hallway. Cole could tell by the economy of his movements, the specific way his body carried itself, when it had been awake long enough that it had stopped asking for rest and simply continued that he hadn't slept. He poured coffee, turned, looked at Cole, looked at the empty chair where the jacket usually lived, and nodded the same way Birch had nodded. They drank without speaking. The morning held itself in the winter stillness that Spokane did better than anywhere Cole had ever been. In 3 hours and 40 minutes, they would walk into a building and ask a stranger to look at their lives and find them sufficient. Cole was rinsing his cup when he heard the sound outside. Not engines. The absence of engine sound was the first thing he registered, which meant people on foot, which meant something deliberate rather than incidental. He crossed to the window and looked out. They were already there. 15 of them, maybe more, standing along the sidewalk in a line that extended from the clubhouse door to the corner of the building. Not moving, not talking, just standing in the early morning gray with their hands at their sides, dressed in the cleanest versions of themselves, which meant leather and denim and work boots, but worn with a particular intentionality, a care that communicated itself even at this distance. Stanton Webb was at the front, closest to the door, his lined face and silver hair making him look in this light like something that had been standing in one place long enough to become part of the landscape. Cole pushed through the door. The cold hit him. He stood on the step and looked at the line of them and didn't say anything immediately because what was happening in his chest made speech temporarily complicated. He knew these people. He knew their histories and their failures, and the specific shapes of what each of them had had to overcome to be standing on a sidewalk at 5 in the morning in February. He knew who among them had lost children of their own, who had grown up the way he'd grown up, who had built their lives on foundations the world had tried to tell them weren't valid. Stanton Webb stepped forward. "You didn't think we'd let you walk in there alone," he said. It was not a question. Cole looked at him. He still didn't fully trust his voice. He nodded. Stanton clapped a hand on his shoulder once solid and stepped back into line. They rode to the courthouse together, not loudly, not with the kind of presence that announced itself and demanded attention. Just 15 motorcycles moving through the early streets of Spokane in a line deliberate and quiet. Cole at the front of them, with Birch to his left and Dax to his right. The same formation they'd held on the night they found Lydia, the same geometry, as if the world had a grammar it returned to when something important was happening and needed to be witnessed. They parked. They walked in together. Cole heard the sound their collective footsteps made in the marble corridor of the courthouse and thought about how institutional spaces were built to make you feel small. The ceilings too high and the walls too hard and the light too uniform. Everything constructed at a scale that reminded you the institution was larger than any individual standing inside it. He walked in anyway. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected. That was always the thing about the rooms where important things happen. They were never as large as the importance suggested they should be. Wooden benches, high windows letting in the flat winter light, the judge's bench elevated at the front with the particular authority of elevation, a state seal on the wall, the smell of old paper and central heating and decades of consequential decisions. Claire was already there, seated at the table to the left, a leather folio open in front of her, and a pen in her hand that she was holding but not using. She turned when she heard them file in, and her eyes moved across the group of them with an expression that was difficult to read, but that contained, Cole thought, something that was not entirely professional. He sat at the front table with Birch and Dax on either side. The rest of the club filled the benches behind them. Nobody spoke. The room had that courtroom quality of suspended time, of a space holding its breath until the official business of breathing could begin. Gerald Voss arrived 2 minutes before the scheduled start. He was exactly what his letter had suggested. He would be precise, contained, dressed in the kind of dark suit that communicated institutional belonging without effort. He was perhaps 50, with the careful face of a man who had learned long ago to keep his reactions on the inside where they couldn't be used against him. He carried a leather briefcase that he set down with the efficiency of someone who had done this in this room, and rooms like it many times, and who moved through the furniture of this particular theater without having to think about where things went. He glanced at Cole when he sat. A brief glance, professionally neutral, the kind that took inventory without appearing to. Cole looked back and held it. Voss looked away first, not from intimidation, but from the simple discipline of a man who didn't spend unnecessary energy on things that weren't yet required of him. The judge entered. She was older than Cole had expected, mid-60s perhaps, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent decades in rooms where other people were not still. She sat arranged her materials, looked out over the courtroom, with eyes that moved efficiently across it, cataloging everything with the practiced attention of someone who had been doing this long enough that her first impressions were reliable. She looked at the benches behind Cole, at the 15 people sitting there in their leather and their quiet. She looked at Cole. He met her eyes. She put her glasses on and looked at the papers in front of her. This is the preliminary hearing regarding the petition for foster care placement with stated adoption intent for Lydia Ann, currently in residence at the Spokane Children's Home. Her voice was even and practiced and carried the room without effort. The petitioners are Cole Hargrove Birch Calloway and Dax Merritt, applying jointly. Gerald Voss represents the state's interest. Claire Hendricks is present as the assigned caseworker. She looked up. Mr. Voss, the state's position. Voss stood. He was smooth. Cole had to give him that. He opened without dramatics, without the kind of prosecutorial performance that announced itself. Just clear language and a measured register. The voice of institutional reason doing its work. Your Honor, the state's concern in this matter is singular and consistent with our mandate, the welfare of the child. We don't dispute the sincerity of the petitioners. We don't dispute that their initial actions in finding and assisting Lydia were commendable. He paused just long enough. What we do dispute is the suitability of the proposed placement environment as a stable, appropriate long-term home for a 10-year-old girl in state care. He opened his briefcase and removed a folder. The petitioners are active members and leaders of a motorcycle club operating out of a clubhouse in Spokane. This is not a private residence. This is a communal space used for club activities frequented by rotating members with no consistent domestic structure. We have documentation of at least one incident of physical altercation on the premises within the past 3 years. He set a page on the table. We also have the petitioner's combined criminal history, which, while not disqualifying in isolation, paints a picture of a lifestyle in an environment that falls substantially outside what this court would typically consider appropriate for a child in a vulnerable developmental stage. He sat down. Cole felt the room absorb it, felt Birch to his left not moving, felt Dax to his right not moving, felt the bench behind him not moving. The judge looked at Claire. Miss Hendricks. Claire stood. She was steady. Cole had watched her be steady in various circumstances over the past 2 weeks, and he had developed a genuine respect for her version of it, which was not the steadiness of someone who felt nothing, but the steadiness of someone who felt things and had decided to function in spite of them. Your Honor, I've conducted this assessment personally. 3 home visits, extensive interviews with each petitioner individually and collectively, background review, financial review, and ongoing contact with Lydia herself. She opened her folio. The picture that emerges is substantially more complex than the state's summary suggests. She walked through it methodically. The home visits, what she'd found, what had been present, and what had been absent. The interview findings, the financial documentation that showed stable income from 3 sources and the capacity to support a child. She spoke about each of the 3 petitioners in specific terms, not defending them in the abstract, but describing what she had actually observed, which was specific and therefore harder to argue with than any generality. Voss interjected once about the incident report. Claire acknowledged it and continued. Then she stopped. She closed her folio. Cole watched her face change. It was subtle, just a degree or 2 of shift visible to him, because he'd been watching her face for 2 weeks, and he knew its professional register. This was something different from that register. This was a woman who had decided to say something she hadn't put in any report. Your Honor, Claire said, and her voice had changed too, the practiced evenness of it, carrying something new underneath it, something that hadn't been there when she'd started. I've been doing this work for 11 years. I've processed more placements than I can count. I've written reports on homes that looked perfect on paper and turned out to be anything but. And I've written reports on homes that looked wrong on paper and turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to a child. She paused. What I observed in that clubhouse was a group of people who, when they found a child in danger, stopped. Didn't calculate the risk, didn't weigh their options, stopped. And since that night, they have done everything within and beyond the requirements of this process to demonstrate that stopping was not a moment of impulse, but a statement of intention. Voss was on his feet. Your Honor, Miss Hendricks is offering editorial opinion rather than assessment findings. I'm offering context, Claire said. And she didn't look at Voss when she said it. She kept her eyes on the judge. And I want to put one more thing on record, Your Honor. Lydia has been at the Spokane Children's Home for 14 months. In 14 months, not one person from that institution noticed when she left. She was gone for 5 days in February before anyone outside of these three men took any action. If we're discussing what constitutes a suitable environment, I think that context is directly relevant. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Voss began to compose a response, and the judge raised one hand not sharply, just firmly, and he stopped. Mr. Hargrove, the judge said, the petitioners have an opportunity to speak. I'd like to hear from you directly. Cole stood. He had thought about this moment for 2 weeks. He had turned it over and looked at it from different angles and considered what to say and how to say it, and somewhere in the middle of that process, he had arrived at the understanding that the version of this that worked was not the version where he'd prepared a speech. The version that worked was the version where he simply told the truth, because the truth was the only thing he had that Voss couldn't file a motion against. He looked at the judge. I grew up in foster care, he said. 7 placements in 10 years across 3 states. Some of those homes were decent. Most of them were the kind of place where you learned very quickly that you were a category rather than a person, where you understood that the people responsible for you were managing a situation rather than raising a child. He paused. I know what that feels like. I know it not as a concept, but as a physical memory. The specific quality of a room that houses you but doesn't belong to you. The way you learn to take up as little space as possible because taking up space leads to consequences. The way you stop telling people things because telling people things has never once produced a result you could rely on. The courtroom was very quiet. I stopped expecting anyone to come for me when I was 11 years old, Cole said. That's not a dramatic statement. It's just what happened. I made a decision at 11 that I would stop hoping for a thing that wasn't going to happen, and I made peace with it, and I built my life on top of that decision because it was the only foundation available to me. He looked down for a moment and then back up. What I built is what's sitting in this courtroom, a club that people call unconventional, an environment that doesn't match the template, a group of people who found each other because the conventional options hadn't worked for any of us, and who built something with their own hands that the world hadn't offered to build for them. He looked at Voss briefly, not with hostility, just looked. When I found Lydia, she was curled against a dumpster in February. She weighed almost nothing. Her lips had gone pale and her shivering had slowed, and she'd been out there for 5 days without a single person coming to look for her. He stopped. I didn't stop because I had calculated that it was the right thing to do. I stopped because when I looked at her, I saw myself at 11 years old, lying on my back in the dark in a house in Wisconsin, looking at a ceiling I didn't recognize, having just decided to stop expecting anyone to come. He held the judge's gaze. I stopped because I was the one who came, finally, 30 years later than it should have happened. But I was there and I stopped, and I am not walking away from that. He sat down. The room held what he'd said. Let it exist in the air. Birch spoke next. He was rougher than Cole, less linear, but there was something in the roughness that worked the unpolished quality of a man saying exactly what he meant without the intermediary layer of presentation. He talked about not having planned for this about the night, changing something in him that he hadn't known was available to be changed about what it meant to be willing, even when you weren't ready. He talked about Lydia's face when she'd looked at them in the clubhouse. The way she'd looked at them, like she was deciding whether to spend something she'd been saving for a long time. Dax stood last. The courtroom had the quality of a room that had been listening hard and was now listening harder because Dax's silences when you knew him were eloquent, and his words when he used them carried the weight of everything he hadn't said leading up to them. He looked at the judge for a moment, then he said, "She saved us too." He let that sit. I don't know how to explain that to someone who hasn't felt it. But finding her fighting for her sitting in this room today, it's the most useful I've felt in 20 years. And I don't mean useful to her. I mean useful in the way that makes a life feel like it's pointed at something real. He paused. She's 10 years old, and she's been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect her. We're not an institution. We're just people who stopped. He sat down. The room held the silence for several seconds. Voss rose and made his response. It was technically proficient and professionally sound. He acknowledged the emotional weight of what the petitioners had shared and then systematically returned to the structural argument, the argument about categories and environments, and what a court was obligated to consider versus what it was permitted to feel. He was not wrong about the law. He was not wrong about the process. He was making the argument he believed in, and Cole could see that he believed in it, and that made it harder rather than easier to sit across from. The judge listened. She made notes. She asked Voss 2 questions that he answered carefully and completely. Then she set her pen down. She looked at Claire. "Miss Hendricks, is the child present in the building today?" Claire hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "She is, Your Honor. She's in the waiting area with a staff member." Voss was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, I must object to any direct examination of the minor. She is 10 years old, and this proceeding is about her future, Mr. Voss," the judge said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply final. "I'm aware of that more than anyone in this room." She looked at the bailiff. "Please bring Lydia in." The door at the side of the courtroom opened. Cole turned without meaning to. Lydia walked in with the deliberate steadiness of a child who had decided somewhere between the waiting area and this door that she was not going to let the room see her afraid. She was wearing her school clothes clean, the ones the home had presumably put her in for the occasion. She looked at the room, at the wooden benches, and the elevated judge's bench, and the state seal, and the people she didn't know. And then she found Cole, and for just a second, something moved across her face that she then put away. She sat in the chair the bailiff indicated. It was positioned so that she faced the judge, but could see Cole in her peripheral vision. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the judge. "Lydia," the judge said, and her voice had shifted, the formal register dropping just a degree, becoming something that recognized it was speaking to a person who hadn't asked to be in this room. "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But if you're willing, I'd like you to tell me in your own words something about the night these men found you." Lydia looked at the judge steadily. She didn't look at Voss. She didn't look at her hands. She looked at the judge the way she'd looked at Cole the night he'd found her, with the direct, honest attention of someone who had not yet learned to look away from things. The courtroom was absolutely still. Then Lydia said, "It was the first time someone stopped. Not because it was their job, because they wanted to." She stopped. That was all she said. 8 words in a silence. Voss opened his mouth and closed it again. The judge looked at Lydia for a long time. Then she looked at Cole. Then she looked back at the papers in front of her, and she picked up her pen and she wrote something down, and she set the pen down again. "Thank you, Lydia," she said. "You can go back to the waiting area." Lydia stood. She looked at Cole one more time as she passed the front table, and what she put in that look was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Then she walked back through the door, and the door closed, and the room resumed breathing. The judge took off her glasses and held them in her hand and looked out at the room. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, she said. "I have reviewed hundreds of placement cases. I have heard arguments on every side of every question that this court handles. I want to say something before I give my ruling, which is this: the law gives me specific things to weigh, and I weigh them. But the law also gives me discretion, and I am going to use it today." She looked at Cole. "Mr. Hargrove, what you described is not an argument for unconventional placements as a general principle. It is an argument for the specific situation, this specific child, and these specific people, and that specificity matters to me. She put her glasses back on. However, I am not in a position to grant permanent placement today. What I am prepared to grant is a provisional foster care arrangement beginning immediately with a mandatory review period of 6 months. During that time, Ms. Hendricks will conduct monthly home visits and provide this court with regular progress reports. At the end of 6 months, we will reconvene and I will make a determination regarding permanent placement. She looked at Cole steadily. This is not approval, Mr. Hargrove. This is an opportunity. The difference is important. Approval is what you've earned. Opportunity is what you're being given. What you do with it will determine everything that comes after. She paused. Don't waste it. The gavel came down. Cole sat for a moment without moving. The sound of it was still in the air, or he was still hearing it, or he needed a few seconds to process what had just happened, which was that they had not won and they had not lost. And somewhere in a waiting area across the hall, a 10-year-old girl was about to be told she was going somewhere else. Birch's hand found his shoulder from the left. Dax was still, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of holding something. It was the stillness of something that had been set down. Claire appeared at the table. Her face was doing something complicated. Congratulations, she said quietly. Provisional is real. Provisional is the door. When can we bring her home? Cole asked. This afternoon, Claire said. I'll go get her now. Cole looked at her. Can I come? Claire considered it for a moment. Then she nodded. He left Birch and Dax with the club and rode behind Claire's county car across Spokane to the Spokane Children's Home, a building he had never been inside, but that had occupied a specific geography in his imagination for the weeks since Lydia had been returned to it. It was a two-story structure on the east side of the city, institutional, in the way all such buildings were. Institutional, built to be functional and durable rather than welcoming. Its architecture communicating the same message that all such architectures communicated to the children inside them. This is a place where temporary things happen. Claire went inside first. Cole waited in the parking lot. He stood in the cold and looked at the building and thought about Lydia in there. He thought about her at the window every afternoon. He thought about the folded piece of paper in her pocket. He thought about what Claire had told him she'd said to that other girl, someone who made a promise. He had almost broken that promise. He knew it with clarity, not through intention, but through the sheer difficulty of what the system placed between intention and outcome. He had almost broken it through paperwork and timelines, and a letter from a man in a suit who had made a reasonable institutional argument that very nearly prevailed. He had almost broken it through no fault of his own, which was somehow the hardest version of almost breaking something to sit with. The door opened. Lydia came through it first, which surprised him. He'd expected Claire to be in front, expected the institutional geometry of an adult leading a child. But Lydia came through the door first with a backpack over one shoulder that was too small for its contents, things stuffed in around the edges, and a zipper that didn't fully close, and she stopped at the top of the steps and looked at the parking lot and found him. She stood there for a moment. Cole didn't move toward her. He waited. He let it be her move, her pace, her moment to cross the distance on her own terms. She came down the steps and walked across the parking lot and stopped in front of him and looked up at him with an expression that was not quite what he'd expected. He'd expected relief or tears or the overwhelming release of a child who'd been holding something too long and was finally allowed to put it down. Instead, her face was very still, very serious. The face of someone who had been thinking hard for 2 weeks and had arrived somewhere with those thoughts. You came back, she said. I told you I would, Cole said. She looked at him for another moment. I kept the paper, she said. The address, I kept it in my pocket the whole time. Cole's throat tightened. I know, he said. Lydia shifted the backpack on her shoulder. Is it far? She asked. No, Cole said. It's not far. Can we ride? She asked. And then immediately, with the clarifying instinct of a child who understood that context mattered, on the motorcycle, not in the car. Cole looked at her. "You want to ride? I want to see what it feels like," she said. "You told me about the wind." He hadn't told her about the wind, not in so many words, but she'd been in the clubhouse when he'd talked about riding with the others, when the conversation had wandered the way clubhouse conversations did, and she had apparently been listening more carefully than he'd known. He looked at Claire. Claire looked at the sky in the parking lot and the county car, and then at the expression on Lydia's face. She let out a breath. "Helmet," she said, "and slow." There was a spare helmet in Cole's saddlebag. There was always a spare helmet, which was either preparation or habit or some combination he'd stopped distinguishing between. He adjusted it to fit Lydia's head, which took several minutes, and the extension of the chin strap to its limit, and it was still slightly large, and she looked at him from inside it with her serious face, and he thought, good. Let there be room to grow into it. She climbed up behind him and put her arms around his waist, and he felt the specific weight of her, the specific grip. And he remembered the night they'd found her, the way she'd felt when he'd lifted her from the pavement, the wrongness of how light she'd been then. She was still slight, but there was something different in how she held herself now, something that hadn't been there on that street in February. He pulled out of the parking lot slowly and kept it slow through the streets. Nothing like the speed he rode when it was just him, or just the three of them. Just a careful and deliberate movement through the city, and he felt Lydia behind him, adjusting to the motion, finding her balance, and then finding something beyond balance. The thing you found on a motorcycle when you stopped fighting the movement and started being part of it. When they crossed this bridge over the river and the city opened up on either side, and the air moved differently, he felt her arms loosen slightly from their initial grip. Not because she was less secure, because she'd understood that she didn't have to hold on for her life. She could hold on simply because it was where she wanted to be. They pulled up to the clubhouse and the door opened before Cole had the engine off. Birch came out first, then Dax, then Stanton, then several others, and nobody made a production of it. Nobody rushed down with the kind of performative welcome that would have been too much. They just came out and stood and let the moment be what it was. Lydia climbed off the bike. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building and then at the people standing in front of it. Her face was still doing the serious thing, the thinking hard thing. And Cole watched her take it all in, the building and the faces and the cold afternoon air, and the fact that this was now in some provisional and legally complicated and entirely real way where she lived. Birch came down the steps. He stopped in front of her and crouched down so he wasn't towering, so they were closer to the same level, and he said, "We made your room up. It's small, but it's yours. Nobody else's name on the door." Lydia looked at him. "There's a door?" she asked. Birch blinked. "Yeah, with a door." "That I can close." "That you can close," he said, "and lock if you want, from the inside." Something moved across her face at that, small and significant. Dax came down next. He didn't crouch. He stood in front of her at his full height and looked down at her, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced something small and folded, and he held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a piece of cloth, a small patch circular stitched in white thread on dark fabric, and in the center of it, in careful, even stitches, was a single word: family. Lydia looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at Dax. He nodded once. That was all. With Dax, that was everything. She held the patch carefully in both hands like it was something that could be damaged by inattention. Stanton Webb came down the steps last moving, with the deliberate pace of a man who had 62 years behind him and had learned to take the important moments at the speed they deserved. He stopped in front of Lydia and looked at her with his weathered face and his careful eyes. "You know what we are," he said. Lydia looked at him. "A motorcycle club," she said. "That's what people call us," Stanton said. "You want to know what we actually are?" She nodded. "We're people who didn't fit anywhere else," he said, "and found each other instead. That's it. That's the whole of it." He looked at her steadily. You fit here, Lydia. You fit here since the night Cole brought you in. The paperwork just took a while to catch up to what was already true. Lydia looked at the patch in her hands. Then she looked at Cole. He came down the steps and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him with the same serious face she'd had in the parking lot when she'd come through the door and found him standing there. "Thank you for coming back," she said. "I told you," he said. "I know," she said, "but I didn't fully believe it until right now." He understood that. He understood it the way he understood things he'd lived from the inside, the specific experience of having been told something true by someone who meant it and still not being able to let yourself believe it until the evidence arrived in a form you couldn't argue with. He had spent years not believing things that turned out to be true because the cost of believing and being wrong was higher than the cost of doubting and being right. He understood exactly why it had taken her until this moment standing in front of him in a parking lot with a patch in her hands to let it be real. "You can believe it now," he said. "It's real." The 6 months that followed were not simple. Cole had not expected them to be simple, and he would have distrusted simplicity if it had arrived, because the things worth having were not simple, and pretending otherwise was the kind of optimism that set people up for the fall that came after. There were difficult days, days when the adjustment was harder than anyone had prepared for, when Lydia's history made itself known in the specific ways that children's histories made themselves known, in the flinching at sudden sounds, in the testing of boundaries to see what they do in the moments of sudden withdrawal that had nothing to do with anything that had happened in the room and everything to do with rooms long before this one. There were nights when Cole heard her from down the hall, the sound a child made, when sleep turned against her and he went and sat outside her door, not entering unless she asked, just there, just present until it passed. Sometimes she opened the door and sometimes she didn't, and both outcomes were okay. Both outcomes meant she was navigating something real, and navigating was better than not. Birch bought her books. He had a system for it, one at a time, chosen based on what she'd said she liked the last time, and each one had her name written inside the front cover in his particular handwriting, which was unexpectedly meticulous for a man who presented himself as careless about most things. Lydia noticed this. She mentioned it to Cole once quietly, that Birch wrote her name in each one, that she had a shelf now, with her name repeated across all the spines in that same handwriting. "That's what he does," Cole said. "Why?" Lydia asked. "So you know they're yours," Cole said. "So no one can say they're not." She thought about that for a moment and then went back to whatever she was doing with the particular efficiency of a child who had received information she needed and had filed it where it belonged. Dax finished the vest. He worked on it in the back room in the evenings over the course of several weeks, and nobody asked him what he was working on because nobody asked Dax questions about things he decided to do privately. But one evening in March, he appeared in the doorway of the main room while Lydia was at the table doing homework, and he crossed to her without announcing himself, and he set the vest down beside her worksheet. She looked at it, then at him. The back of it was visible from where she sat, and on the back, stitched in white thread on black leather, were two words: ride or die. "That's ours," Dax said. "The club's. It means family. It means we go together or we don't go." Lydia touched the stitching with one finger, tracing the letters carefully. "Did you make this?" He nodded. "For me?" He nodded again. She stood up from this table and put it on over her sweater. It would fit differently in a year. She didn't know that yet, but Cole did, and the knowledge sat in his chest like something warm and forward-looking. She looked down at herself and then up at Dax. "Thank you," she said. Dax said nothing, but the expression on his face was the most expressive thing Cole had seen on it in 16 years of knowing him. Claire came every month. Her visits changed in character as the months progressed, the early ones formal and procedural, the clipboard always in hand, the professional effect maintained and necessary. By the third month, there was something different in how she arrived, less the posture of an assessor and more the posture of someone checking in on people she'd developed a genuine investment in. She stayed longer than required. She stopped bringing her own coffee from the shop down the street and started drinking what was made in the clubhouse kitchen without commenting on it, which Cole considered a form of affection. She and Lydia developed a relationship that existed outside Claire's professional role in the specific jokes that accumulated between people who saw each other regularly in the shorthand of shared references. Cole watched this and was glad for every thread of it, every connection that Lydia accumulated, every person who became real to her, and to whom she became real because that was what he'd been without as a child, and what he understood she'd been without too. And the accumulation of it was not a small thing. It was the foundational thing, the kind that held everything else up. Spring arrived. The snow went the way Spokane snow eventually went gradually, and then all at once, and the streets that had been gray and compressed under winter came back to themselves, and there were mornings when Cole came out of the clubhouse, and the air smelled like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Lydia learned to ride the bicycle that Birch had found at an estate sale and quietly refurbished and left by the door of the clubhouse on a Saturday morning in April without saying anything about it. She found it there, looked at it for a long moment, looked at Birch across the room. Birch shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a man who had spent considerable time on a thing and was pretending not to have done so. She went outside and taught herself to ride it in the parking lot with the focused determination she brought to anything she decided to do. Cole watched from the window. She fell twice, got up both times immediately without drama, without waiting to see if anyone was watching. Just got up. That was Lydia. The hearing reconvened on a Thursday in August, 6 months to the week from the provisional ruling. The sky was different this time, summer blue and high and wide, the kind of sky that belonged to the version of Spokane that existed on the other side of winter. Cole wore the same gray shirt, left the jacket on the chair for the same reason as before. They went in the same way. 15 people on the sidewalk, Stanton at the front, the same line, the same quiet. Cole stood at the top of the steps and looked at them and felt the same thing he'd felt in February, but different now, deeper, more settled, less about needing the support, and more about knowing it was simply there, regardless of what he needed. Voss was there. He was professionally consistent, which Cole had come to respect even while opposing him. He presented Claire's monthly reports, which he could not do much with, because Claire's monthly reports were thorough and honest, and described 6 months of a child being steadily, undramatically, genuinely okay in a place she'd chosen to be. Claire presented herself. She was different in this room than she'd been in February, and Cole noticed it in the way she stood, in the way she opened her folio. She had been a professional who cared in February. She was a professional with a stake now, and the difference was visible if you knew what you were looking for. Voss made his closing argument. It was good. He was good. But Cole could feel, even before the judge spoke, that Voss was making an argument against something that had already happened, that the 6 months had made a reality that briefs and precedents couldn't reach. The judge looked at Claire's reports. She looked at the summary of home visits. She looked at the documentation of school enrollment and medical care, and the teacher's note that Claire had included the one that said Lydia had gone from the quietest child in the room to the one who stayed after class to ask the most questions. She took her glasses off. "I'm going to be brief," the judge said, "because the record speaks clearly enough that anything I add risks obscuring rather than clarifying." She looked at Cole. "Mr. Hargrove, 6 months ago, I gave you an opportunity and told you not to waste it. I want it on the record that you did not waste it." She looked down at the papers and then back up. "This court finds that permanent placement is appropriate and grants the petition for adoption. Lydia will be the legal daughter of Cole Hargrove, with Birch Calloway and Dax Merritt designated as secondary guardians with full parental standing." The gavel came down. The room did not erupt. The people who had been there in February knew how to hold important things quietly by now. What happened was quieter and larger than eruption, a collective exhale, a settling, the sound of people who had been holding something for a long time, finally being allowed to set it down. Cole sat with his hands on the table and let it be real. He looked to his left, and Birch was looking at the ceiling with his jaw tight and his eyes doing something he would not have called crying, and that was nevertheless crying. He looked to his right and Dax had his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table and his face was doing the thing it did when the interior volume had exceeded what the exterior could contain. Claire appeared at the table. Cole looked at her and what he saw made him stop. She was not composed, not in the professional way she'd maintained across 6 months of visits and reports and the careful management of a process that had required her to be the institution's representative, even while quietly being something more than that. She was standing at the edge of the table with her folio held against her chest, and her eyes were full and her face was open in the way faces went open when they'd stopped performing. She looked at Cole. 11 years, she said, and her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear it. I've been doing this 11 years. I've written reports on children who got good outcomes and children who didn't. I've sat in rooms like this one more times than I can count. She stopped, started again. This is the first time I felt like the actual thing worked. Not the system, the thing underneath it, the thing the system is supposed to be for. She paused. That's because of you. All of you. Because you refused to let it fail. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She nodded back. That evening after the court, after the drive back, after the celebration, that was warm and full of food and laughter, and a cake that Stanton had apparently ordered 2 weeks earlier, because he decided to believe in the outcome before it arrived. Cole found himself alone with Lydia for a few minutes in the quiet of her room. She was sitting on her bed with the vest in her lap, looking at the stitching. The shelf on the wall had books on it, more than it had in March, and they had her name inside them. The door had a small drawing on it that she had made herself a motorcycle and a figure riding it and a word underneath. Home. You want to tell me something? Cole asked. He'd learned to read her silences the way he'd learned to read Dax's by paying attention long enough that the differences between them became legible. She looked up. I used to think it was my fault, she said, that no one noticed me. I used to think it was something about me specifically, that if I was different or better, somehow things would have been different. Cole sat down in the chair by the desk. And now, he asked. Now I know it wasn't about me, she said. It was about them. They weren't paying attention. That's not the same thing as me not being worth paying attention to. Cole looked at her. At this 10-year-old, now legally and in every way that mattered, his daughter sitting on a bed in a room with her name on the shelf, in a building where she had decided over 6 months to become real. That's right, he said. That's exactly right. She nodded. She'd known it was right. She was checking, not asking. Cole, she said. Yeah. Can we go back tomorrow to the street where you found me? He looked at her. You sure you want to? I want to see it in the summer, she said. When it doesn't look the same. I want to see it and know that it's different now. She paused. And I want to be there with you. All three of you. Yeah, Cole said. We can do that. She nodded, satisfied, and looked back down at the vest. He sat with her for a while longer. Outside, the clubhouse was making its evening sounds, the sounds of people living their lives in reasonable proximity to each other, voices and movement, and the particular music of a place that held things without letting them go. Through the window, the Spokane sky was going down in shades of orange and deep blue, the summer sky doing what the winter sky never did, which was to go down with warmth and color. Cole looked at the drawing on the door. The next morning they went back, all four of them, Cole and Birch and Dax on their bikes, and Lydia on the small bicycle Birch had found and refurbished, the one she'd taught herself to ride in the parking lot on an April afternoon. They took the same streets they'd taken on the night they'd found her moving slowly, and nobody said where they were going because Lydia already knew, and the three men had known since the night before when she'd asked. They stopped at the corner. The dumpster was still there, rusted at the base, unchanged by anything that had happened in the months since. In August, it looked entirely different than it had in February, the way all things look different in summer, the light and the warmth and the absence of snow changing the character of a place without changing its bones. Lydia got off her bicycle and walked to it and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Cole came to stand beside her. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out something small. A keychain, silver simple, worn already from 2 weeks of carrying it in his pocket while he waited for the right moment, and on it, 3 words engraved in plain block letters, "Never alone again." He held it out. She took it and looked at it, and then looked at the dumpster, and then looked at him. "I came here to find out if anyone would notice," she said, "if anyone would come." "I know," Cole said. "Did you know when you stopped that you were answering that question?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I just stopped." She looked at the keychain in her palm, at the 3 words. The summer light was on her face, and she looked nothing like the girl he'd lifted off the pavement on the worst night of February. And she looked exactly like her all at the same time, the way people carried their histories in their faces without being defined by them. "I got my answer," she said. She closed her hand around the keychain. Behind them, Birch and Dax stood without speaking. The way they stood when standing was the right thing, and words would only diminish it. The August sun came down on the 4 of them on a Spokane street that looked nothing like what it had been the night they'd all found each other. The city moved around them the way cities moved, indifferent and continuous. And in the middle of it, the 4 of them held still together for a moment. The way you held still when something had ended and something else had begun, and you wanted to be present for the scene between them. A girl who had run to find out if she was worth looking for. 3 men who had stopped when the world said keep riding. And the distance between who they'd been before that February night and who they were now, which was not a distance at all anymore. It was just where they lived.